Earl Weaver was a conundrum wrapped in an enigma. And to me, I got the sense reading and studying him that perhaps he never even fully understood himself. But that can be the way of geniuses. His behavior in baseball and most of life often led with the crude, the loud, and even the offensive, and yet there was a side of Earl Weaver that loved quiet time gardening and that could quote Shakespeare at length. He often appeared on the surface as impulsive and erratic, but below that was a very cerebral and well-prepared manager. A guy that had an exhaustive knowledge of the rule book and knew how to find loopholes in it, and who prepared, without the aid of computers or AI, mind you, statistically in ways that were way ahead of his time. He was Moneyball before Moneyball. And underneath all the quotable lines, the fights with umpires, and the vaudeville act that he was known for, this man just won ball games. The tale of his tape as it relates to the games his Orioles teams won before, during, and after his managing days say it all. Comparing like 162-game seasons, before Weaver, the Orioles won just 70 games per year from 1901 to 1953, then 81.9 games from 1954 to 1967. But during Earl's tenure, starting in 1968, which lasted 17 seasons across two different stints, they exploded to 94.5 wins per season. After that, all the way back down to 76 games a season. That's a clip they've kept up from 1987 all the way through last year. John W. Miller shares that record in his excellent book that just came out in March of 2025, and it's the book we're using as the source text today, and it's called The Last Manager: How Earl Weaver Tricked, Tormented, and Reinvented Baseball. Miller also frames Weaver's managerial greatness in there by saying, in 12 full seasons between 1968 and 1982, not counting the strike seasons of 1972 and 1981, Earl Weaver won at least 90 games in 11 seasons and averaged 97 wins. The Orioles won more games and recorded a better run differential than any other team in baseball. No other franchise has had such an astonishing explosion of success and glory so linked to one manager. If anyone has Weaver figured out, it's John W. Miller. In my opinion, Miller does an absolutely masterful job covering Weaver in his book, from how he sets up and frames Weaver's early life, to his incredibly rich descriptions of Weaver as a manager, to how he pulls in player quotes and player perspectives to help you understand how Weaver came across in the eyes of his players. It's really an incredible work and one worth picking up. As always, there'll be a link to it in the show notes. But today in the episode, we're going to jump into some of the things I love best about studying that book and Earl Weaver. We'll compare him and the era he managed in to the managers of today, which is a fun and illuminating exercise because the contrast is so stark in so many aspects. But it also has a great human connection commonality about how important relationships and authenticity are. We're also going to chronicle what an innovator Earl Weaver was, including how he pioneered the use of the radar gun, and how he was, as I mentioned before, way ahead of the game with Moneyball stuff, especially as it relates to on-base percentage and moving away from small ball, and in his words, being about pitching, defense, and 3-run home runs. There are other great coaching takeaways, his intensity and his crazy like a fox ways that we'll knock out as well. There'll also be a part 2, a bonus episode on Earl, covering more of the story content on him, of which there are ample amounts. In that episode, we'll cover some of his famous clashes with umpires, but also some of the more personal layers of Earl, like his deep insecurity about not making it as a player and how that motivated him as a manager. His mob boss uncle that was super influential to him. And hand in hand with that, a little bit about the bookies and the gambling scene of 1940s, 50s St. Louis, and those bookies' keen eye for statistics, and how they might have influenced Earl's managing style. Maybe it was actually the bookies that were Moneyball before Moneyball. Without further ado, let's dive into this man with the, as mentioned in the 1982 song about him by Terry Cashman, Fightin' Fire and Leprechaun Smile, Earl Weaver. This is the Coaches Podcast. I think it's really important to set the stage and the context about the era of managers Earl grew up in and around, because they were worlds apart in many respects from the managing climate today. Miller summarizes present-day baseball quite well when he says, teams are now billion-dollar entertainment corporations that accumulate data as if they were the U.S. Census Bureau and place their managers at the center of sprawling org charts that informally include private trainers and agents. Big league teams travel with more than double the people than they did in Weaver's day, including 75 or so ball players, coaches, analysts, nutritionists, trainers, psychologists, and public relations officials. And of the manager's role specifically, Miller says, by necessity, the typical modern manager is capable of reading and writing corporate memos, understanding at least parts of multiple languages, and directing ambitious, self-centered elite athletes. In other words, modern-day managers are closer to CEOs or salesmen on behalf of the front office than in days past. They're not the autocratic my way or the highway managers of Earl's era. Let's read what Miller has to say about that. The 1970s baseball managers reigned supreme, sometimes bigger stars than their players. In July 1983, Earl Weaver was the Playboy magazine Interview of the Month. Baseball's rowdy genius, the cover called him. For context, other Playboy interview subjects in 1983 included writer Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who just won the Nobel Prize for Literature, media mogul and CNN founder Ted Turner, best-selling author Stephen King, actor Paul Newman, and photographer Ansel Adams. That was the level of fame and cultural relevancy that Earl Weaver, a baseball manager, occupied. And following from that, Earl was anything but the polished, canned answer CEO type. Just listen to a typical post-game scene for Weaver with the media. Miller says, after games, Weaver sometimes held court in the nude, smoking Raleighs, drinking Schlitz beer with salt, and munching on fried chicken. There was a urinal next to the manager's office where Earl could continue his soliloquies while peeing. So yeah, not quite the guy typing up corporate memos or learning new languages to communicate with his players or coddling any egos there. He came from what was known as the star manager era, and that's important to note as well. Earl grew up around and was perhaps himself the last of these autocratic star managers. It says of his childhood, managers fascinated a young Earl. As baseball boomed in popularity in the 20th century, pushed by mass-market newspapers and radio, journalists and fans celebrated managers as the voices of their teams and sport. This was obviously pre-TV, pre-internet, and social media, and so with less visual cues and less frequency, and the writers and radio people romanticizing these guys, people's imagination of these guys grew larger than life. And hand in hand with that star manager era was the era of the autocratic manager. Earl was perhaps the last of those as well. You had guys like Lou Piniella and Tommy Lasorda come along later, but those guys lived in the world of free agency. Free agency hits baseball in 1975, still 7 years before Earl retires, but not early enough in his career that he was defined by it. And free agency, as we know, changed everything. It tipped the power balance to the players and created a tailwind for them that's still blowing with ever-increasing velocity to this day. There's some great content in the book around that, around Reggie Jackson, who was the poster boy that ushered in this era. When he moved from the A's, went briefly to Earl Weaver's Orioles, but ultimately onto the Yankees through free agency, where they proved you could buy championships, and won 2 immediately with Reggie after a 15-year drought. Reggie marked the end of the player property era, where managers could no longer lord over them and permanently control their future. And so players had more leverage and salaries skyrocketed. It sounds a heck of a lot like what's going on with NIL right now in college athletics, doesn't it? The power balance has shifted from coaches to players, pushing out guys like Nick Saban and other legends of his ilk that might have represented an older guard. David Bell, manager of the Cincinnati Reds when this book came out in 2025, I'd almost forgotten about him. I loved him as a player and loved hearing about what a cerebral manager he was in this book. A very well-read guy. But Bell is quoted in this book as saying, managers can no longer scream like Weaver did at Rick Dempsey. There are just too many games, Bell says, and after a certain point, players will lose respect for you. Bobby Valentine, who was a player, but was best known for managing the Rangers, Red Sox, and mostly the Mets, also shares in this book of this shift that has happened since Weaver. One reason managers can't resort to threats anymore is because they'd have the players' union and the players' agent howling. Before, managers had the hammer, and as a leader, you could say it's my way or the highway, and the highway is life in the minor leagues. You can't do that anymore. Valentine even shared that he himself as a player, under such regimes, was even demoted to the minor leagues because the manager didn't like the way he gave an underhand feed to a second baseman. It's also interesting to note, in Japan, where Valentine managed as well, autocracy still rules. Baseball culture is more hierarchical. The boss is the boss, Valentine says. What I find really cool, though, and to be less unproductively critical or nostalgic about how things used to be, is how there's still one key, and that is relationships. Good old-fashioned human-to-human connection. Things like truly listening to people, giving them attention. I love this part of the book because Joe Madden said the exact same thing in his book. In my episode on Madden, I portray that as Madden's Albert Einstein way of simplifying the game. Einstein's highest level of intelligence was simplicity, making complex tasks simple. So for Madden and the complex task of managing a major league ball club, was it sabermetrics? No. Was it pitching and defense? No. Was it load management? No. It was relationships. All those things I just mentioned have their varying levels of importance and must be tended to, but it's the relationships that make them their best. That's what makes the magic happen. Joe Madden says something to the effect of, once you get the relationships going with the players, the front office, etc., and get that information flowing back and forth, that's when some really magical things can happen, such as breaking a 108-year-old curse for the Cubs. And when Madden started in Tampa Bay and Chicago, and he had his opening press conferences with the media corps, and they were asking him in Tampa Bay how as a first-time manager he was going to approach it, and then later down the road in Chicago how he was going to approach managing the team. He said the same thing in both of those press conferences, and that was, my priority is to get the relationships going. I thought that was such awesome clarity and a super instructive thing from Joe Madden. Back to David Bell, he has some great content in this book on this topic as well. He says, baseball players respond to authenticity. You cannot do something that's not true to yourself because they won't believe you ever again. And more to the bullseye of what we're talking about here, Bell says, getting to know each of these players as people, building that trust is everything. Craig Counsell of the Cubs, but then the Brewers, is quoted in here as well, saying, a large part of a manager's job is still people. That has not changed. And then also in here, Miller says, managers still matter. And they look to the story of Earl Weaver for inspiration, because he stands for the qualities that will always have value and can never be quantified: leadership, passion, and motivation. Lastly, on this point, even Weaver himself defined leadership with one word: honesty. He said his golden rule was no promises to anybody and no lies. Those two go together, he said. If you tell one lie to a player, it gets around instantly. You cease to exist. So in addition to being a fiery, passionate leader, let's call that the emotional side of Earl Weaver, of which there was an ample amount, there was also this keenly cerebral side to him. He was incredibly visionary about the game and had a wonderfully independent and innovative thinking type of mind. The way the radar gun was used in the game, the use of a larger power hitter at shortstop, aka Cal Ripken Jr., and Moneyball, as I've mentioned before, all these things can be traced back to Earl Weaver. Let's start with how Earl Weaver used Cal Ripken and how he was the one who hit the button on that move and changed that position forever. Nowadays, the big power-hitting shortstop is more the norm, but prior to Weaver's use of Cal Ripken Jr., it was not. Ripken got called up in 1981, played some third base, and platooned a bit, but did not play short. The incumbent at that position was a guy more fitting the common mold at the time, Len Sakata, who was 5'9", 160 pounds. The Orioles also had a prospect named Bobby Bonner, who they were considering. He was a bit bigger, 6 feet tall and 185 pounds, but neither were the Cal or A-Rod type. And Weaver had to fight the Orioles front office on this. Weaver wanted to move Cal to short all of the 1981 season, but then GM Hank Peters wasn't having it. He thought he was too big. But in June of 1982, Weaver saw his opportunity when it says he was tired of Len Sakata's average bat and bad defense and Bonner's abysmal hitting. It doesn't give a lot of detail on the degree to which the front office was involved with that, but one gets the impression it was just Weaver's call. Weaver told Ripken, like a friendly uncle, it says, "Hey, just play shortstop like you did in high school." And so he did, and so Weaver and the 6'4", 225-pound Cal Jr. changed that position forever. It says, Ripken emerged as the league's best all-around shortstop, delivering big hits and eye-popping plays punctuated by his cannon arm. Ripken stuck at shortstop every day from 1982 until 1997, cracking offensive and defensive records to become the Iron Man of baseball legend and opening the door for shortstops like Nomar Garciaparra, Derek Jeter, and Alex Rodriguez. Weaver consistently named moving Cal to short as one of his proudest achievements. The radar gun is a fun story. A guy named Danny Litweiler was the inventor of it, and Litweiler actually played pro ball and had a super cool stat to his name. In 1942, he became the first player in baseball history to play every game of his team's season without making an error. After his playing days, Litweiler was also a great coach. He was the longtime Michigan State baseball coach from 1964 to 1985. And this guy was like the Thomas Edison of baseball, always inventing, always tinkering. In addition to the radar gun, he created an unbreakable pitching mirror that it says a hurler could throw into while watching his motion, which the Cincinnati Reds actually used in the pre-video days. He created a 5-man batting cage to help encourage hitters to hit the ball up the middle, and all sorts of stuff. And it says that when he saw a headline in the MSU paper reading, "MSU police get radar gun," a light bulb went off. And he talked to his neighbor, who was one of the MSU police officers, and then he worked with Jugs to make a battery-powered prototype, and the rest, as they say, is history. But Earl Weaver saw the benefit of this immediately and with more vision and clarity than anyone else. He was the first professional baseball guy to use it. Genius stuff from Earl here, and hard to believe, but before this, it was a total thumb-in-the-air type of thing with your naked eye to try to determine a pitcher's velocity. Earl said, "We could get a lot of use out of this thing. I'd like to have it for timing Jim Palmer's fastball from a few years ago and comparing it with now. It would be invaluable for scouting. You'd know exactly how fast a pitcher was. It would help teams dissect old baseball concepts like sneaky fast." And he brilliantly continued, "It could be used for training and pitch design. It would help us get pitchers to throw at exactly the right speed. We could get all our pitchers to try to have a 20-mile-an-hour difference between their fastballs and their changes." It said Weaver had never known why Ross Grimsley's changeup was so effective, but he confessed now he knew thanks to the radar gun. He also discovered that one of his outfielders, Larry Harlow, threw 92 miles an hour, harder than any of his pitchers, so he resolved to pitch Harlow in a game, which he did a few years later. Weaver smartly told reporters that the radar gun's best use was measuring not sheer velocity, but the difference in speeds between pitches. If the guy's fastball comes in at 88 and his slider comes in at 88, that's no good, Weaver said. You want the slider to be a little slower, maybe 82. That's what makes the batter hesitate and stick his butt out. So Weaver was like a duck to water with this thing, and he was the first guy to use it for in-game decisions as well. No one else was doing this. Another bit of gold here from Weaver, he said to Dan Duquette about his thinking on the in-game use of the radar gun, "Danny, I'm trying to figure out if my pitcher is done for the day before the hitter tells me by hitting a 3-run homer." It seems rudimentary today, but at this time it was highly visionary. And this just showed me how Weaver had some of that original thinker stuff going on, much like Joe Madden, who was one of the original guys to put the shift on, which he did on David Ortiz after studying his very polarizing spray chart. And finally, on the radar gun front, it's fun to note that beyond those really clever baseball uses, Earl would carry their one and only radar gun, they were super expensive at the time, all around the ballpark and beyond with him, and he was totally enamored with it. Being the big kid he was, he'd take it on the bus, pointed at cars, planes, etc. to track how fast things were moving and to generally harass people with it. As I've alluded to a few times already, Earl Weaver was Moneyball before Moneyball. He was perhaps the one most original in his thought and analysis around this, because he did so without the aid of computers and without any prevailing trend influencing him. In fact, the trends were still old school baseball, small ball, bunting, etc. And he was an original for going full contrarian to those with a lot of success. As Tom Verducci said in a 2009 Sports Illustrated article, Weaver was the Copernicus of baseball. Just as Copernicus understood heliocentric cosmology a full century before the invention of the telescope, Weaver understood smart baseball a generation before it was empirically demonstrated. And Miller backs this up as well. I'm paraphrasing a bit here, but he says, 21st century baseball teams have adopted the analytics-based approaches Weaver prophesized, and they hired managers who bunted less, prioritized walks, home runs, and orchestrated favorable pitcher-batter matchups. Weaver's favorite mantra, of course, was pitching, defense, and 3-run home runs, and he loved walks and on-base percentage. And to that end, I want to highlight a story. Before the Greek god of walks, Kevin Youkilis, that nickname made famous for him in Michael Lewis's book and the movie Moneyball, there was Ken Singleton. It says in the book, in 1974, the Orioles traded Dave McNally, Rich Coggins, and Bill Kirkpatrick to the Montreal Expos for Ken Singleton and Mike Torres. The prize was Singleton, a switch-hitting, power-hitting outfielder from New York with a skill for drawing walks. In other words, the platonic ideal of an Earl Weaver baseball player. Singleton was coming off a decent year and had a great on-base percentage, but his home runs had plummeted from 23 to 9, and so Miller says in the book, that made him expendable in the eyes of the Expos. But unlike other teams, the Orioles and Weaver understood Singleton's true value, largely that of his on-base percentage. It goes on, when Singleton showed up at spring training, to his surprise, Weaver told him that he would bat leadoff for the Orioles. I don't steal bases, Singleton said. I don't care, said Weaver. It's about getting on base. And then in the first game of Singleton's Orioles career, he drew a walk and scored on a Lee May 3-run home run. And when he came into the dugout, it says Weaver was all fired up seeing that his strategy had played out to perfection and stuck his finger in Singleton's chest and said, "That's what I'm expletive talking about." As a teaser for my bonus episode on Weaver, a lot of this inspiration and smart use of statistics actually came from Earl's upbringing around the intense gambling scene in St. Louis during the 1940s and 50s and being around his highly influential mob boss uncle who was deep into that scene. As one bookie from that era is quoted as saying, "Bookies could teach Casey Stengel a thing or two." Let's talk a bit more tactical for a second and get into some of the rubber meets the road coaching takeaways from Earl. You don't have to look too hard for them. Earl laid most of them out in his 1984 book, Weaver on Strategy. The original is out of print now, but I found one on abesbooks.com for $5. Also, a publisher called Potomac Books rebooted it in 2002. I'll leave a link to that one in the show notes. But that book is centered on Weaver's 10 laws, which are great and mostly still relevant. I'll read them here. 1. No one is going to give a damn in July if you lost a game in March. 2. If you don't make any promises to your players, you won't have to break them. 3. The easiest way around the bases is with one swing of the bat. Again, Weaver was the guy that blew up small ball and went for on-base percentage and 3-run home runs. 4. Your most precious possession on offense are your 27 outs. Bobby Valentine here again says Weaver gave him this advice in 1986, and he had to laugh many years later when one can assume, highly paid front office analyst handed him a paper that stated the exact same thing Weaver had told him all those years ago. 5. If you play for one run, that's all you'll get. 6. Don't play for one run unless you know that one run will win the game. 7. It's easier to find 4 good starters than 5. 8. The best place for a rookie pitcher is in long relief. And to add some commentary here again, he was an impulsive guy in many ways, and yet he saw the forest for the trees and exercised great wisdom and patience breaking in rookie pitchers. Another example of those brilliantly juxtaposing qualities of Weaver. 9. The key step for an infielder is the first one, left or right, but before the ball is hit. 10. The job of arguing with an umpire belongs to the manager because it won't hurt the team if he gets thrown out of the game. Probably some self-rationalization for Weaver and his antics with number 10 there. I just want to share one last thing from the book that Miller shares, and this speaks to, in sort of a humorous way, Earl's anti-small ball stance. He says, "I've got nothing against the bunt in its place, but most of the time that place is at the bottom of a long-forgotten closet." For the record, I love small ball as part of the game, and I was glad to see it come back a bit with the 2025 Blue Jays and their run to the World Series. Let's talk about Weaver's high degree of emotional intelligence. Tom Boswell, who covered Weaver for many years with the Washington Post, was quoted after Earl's death saying, "He didn't open up often, but when he did, you were floored. He knew himself, why he was and who he was, and why he managed the way he did. as well as anyone I've ever covered. We knew he had examined baseball and hadn't missed much, but he'd also examined himself and analyzed in every detail everyone around him too. And there's an incredible story I want to highlight that drives this point home. So it's August of 1974, late in the season. The Orioles are below 500. They're 63-65, and they're in fourth place, 8 games back behind the Boston Red Sox, and things in the Orioles organization are not great. Weaver is his usual unhinged self, but that doesn't go over well, being 8 games back. And the front office is really upset with Earl, and the players are unmotivated and feeling what I would call the dark side of the moon with Earl Weaver, and they're thinking he's in a managerial slump. And something really crazy happens. The players call a secret players-only meeting at the house of outfielder Paul Blair and form the shadow government, it says in the book. It's a total clandestine operation here by the Orioles players, a coup, if you will. They develop a system to call their own steal, hit and run, and bunt plays. It says to bear down on the proper fundamentals, like moving runners over and hitting the cutoff man. It was the insurrection of 1974, as fellow outfielder Don Baylor called it. So that's crazy, right? In the book it says the young players were nervous. Deep down inside, I was scared, said Don Baylor, who later managed 9 years in the big leagues. There I was, my 3rd year in the big leagues, and about to enter into rebellion against Weaver. In one game, Baylor was given the bunt sign, but player leader Brooks Robinson deploys this shadow government and calls it off, and signals to Baylor to hit away. Baylor, thankfully for his case, roped a double off the wall, and so it worked out. But what I find really interesting about this is, yes, the stones of these guys to pull this off. It's one of those things that probably holds both the truths of the players being insubordinate, but also them showing great leadership. But beyond that, I also find it very telling the high degree of emotional intelligence and restraint Earl Weaver himself had in how he responds to this. We know he's known for being fiery and autocratic and intense, right? And one might expect that when Baylor ignores that bunt sign, he would have flown off the handle and come down hard on Baylor. But as we have titled in this episode, Earl is crazy like a fox. Guys like him and Bobby Knight come to mind as well, have this uncanny ability to walk right up to the line with their volatility and their combustibility, but not go over it. And Knight, of course, did that with his famous chair throwing incident, and Weaver had his moments as well. But generally speaking, some of these fiery autocrats secretly have a long-term vision for what they're doing and what's underneath that behavior. In other words, they have some pretty good instincts, restraint, and emotional intelligence in ways that might not be immediately obvious. So on how Earl addresses this shadow government, you'd think he might go full fire and brimstone on these guys, but he doesn't. He actually does nothing. And this is despite the player shadow government being known at this point and being very well documented in the local papers in 1974. Miller explains Weaver's strategic coyness about it all by saying, Weaver loved winning more than being right. If that meant players going behind his back, so be it. He prepared his troops for battle and then backed off. The messy, volatile Weaver had once again figured out a way to lead. And then Jim Palmer's quoted as saying, if Earl had put his foot down and demanded we stop putting on our own signs, we would have obeyed. But there was a trust between us that allowed for creativity. I like to picture Earl Weaver's face when I think of this story again, that leprechaun smile, taking a moment to survey the situation, eyes darting back and forth, thinking several plays ahead in an instance, and cleverly deciding to just say nothing, to let it slide in the name of winning games. I think that story and that response by Earl demonstrates just how differently he was built upstairs. And this works like a charm. Again, they were 8 games back pretty far into August. But it says the loose, self-governing Orioles won 28 of their last 34 games, including a 10-game winning streak, and finally a stunning 11 of 12 streak, including 3 walk-off wins to close that year. They actually went to the ALCS, but lost to Oakland, and Weaver even gets a contract extension and a $5,000 raise from the front office, which was a good raise at the time. So yeah, keen restraint by Weaver. Sometimes the best move is no move at all, you might say. Related, let's talk about Earl's passion, his intensity. In addition to being ahead of his time strategically, he also just brought it to the clubhouse every day as it relates to passion and intensity. Again, authenticity will be responded to. Players might have hated him at times for being the way he was, but he was authentic in his all-out desire to win, and they responded to that. Orioles pitcher Mike Flanagan said, Earl Weaver's drinking came paired with a work ethic and passion that made him care almost violently about every pitch, every game, every practice. That focus on winning, on playing the game right, was intoxicating. He made his players better because he took it all so seriously that he made you think the game was important. He battled for his players. Dan Ford, who was an outfielder for Weaver in 1982, added, players often hated him in the moment, but he never held a grudge, so his presence never weighed them down. They felt free to play their hearts out. He didn't give an expletive about what happened off the field, but we get to the field and put on that uniform, let's go, Ford says. You come to the clubhouse and he's marching through the clubhouse like a general. You're playing to win. Dan Duquette, who was GM of the Expos, Red Red Sox and Orioles and knew Earl from his scouting days in the 80s, had Earl pegged, and sums this point up best. Players liked him because they knew he could help them. They knew that he knew his expletive and that he was on them to get the best out of them as a ball player. He was a crusty expletive, but I believe his only intent was to make the ball players as good as they could be. I'm sure this side of Earl had a double-edged sword and factored into his 2 DUIs and perhaps the failure of his first marriage, but the point on passion is taken. If it's authentic, it makes a difference, and it gets that extra 10 to 20% out of your club that can make all the difference. Related, and to close out this section, let's talk just a bit more about this crazy like a fox theme with Earl, or in this case what I'll call the genius of a madman, and I'll highlight one more really good story to that end. And this one is about his relationship with pitcher Steve Stone when Stone first gets to Baltimore. Steve Stone, perhaps best known as the man who suffered in the WGN booth next to Harry Carey for 20 years, announcing Cubs games. He's now across town in Chicago with the White Sox and has been doing their games since 2008. But Stone was a Cy Young winning pitcher. And in fact, he won that Cy Young with the Orioles in 1980, the year after this crazy scene between he and Earl takes place. To set this up, it's a conversation orchestrated by Ray Miller, the Orioles pitching coach. Stone was a significant free agent that the Orioles signed starting in 1979, but he couldn't stand Weaver when he got to Baltimore, and he was pitching poorly seemingly because of that. He was just 6-7 with a 4.4 ERA going into the All-Star break. And so Ray Miller is fed up with the tension between the two, and he sets up a meeting for Stone and Weaver to hash it out in the coach's room. And Ray Miller even has to sit between them in case there was a fight. So this wasn't just pageantry. There was some real vitriol here. And luckily, we get a transcript of this that is shockingly raw. I'll read it here. Stone: Earl, this is the way I feel. I find you one of the most disgusting human beings I've ever been around, either in baseball or outside of baseball. You sicken me, and I prefer that you trade me after the end of this year. Weaver: Here's the thing. I've got you as my 5th starter, and I'll trade you if I can find somebody better. But I can't trade you. You're my 5th starter. And then Earl points to his hand where presumably there's a statistics book or something like that and says, This book says you're a loser. I don't want you to be a loser, but you're under 500. Stone responds with, Earl, I've played for some bad teams. Weaver: Yeah, but this ain't one of them, and you're 6-7 here. That tells me you're a loser. And like everybody else around here, I want you to be a winner. Weaver then added that Stone would only get a couple of starts in the second half unless he pitched like an ace. So again, very raw moment there. But whether it was because of sheer scorn for Weaver or whatever the case was, it worked on Stone. It says, during the All-Star break, Stone racked his brain about how to improve his game. He developed a system of visualization and positive thinking and threw more curveballs. And this leads to a 5-0 second half for Stone, along with 8-0 decisions. And then again, carries over into the next year. Stone has far and away his best year in the majors and goes 25-7, winning the American League Cy Young Award and becoming the starter in the All-Star game for the AL that season. It says in the book, in the 50 starts after he told Weaver he never wanted to see him again, Stone went 30-7. Steve Stone is even quoted in the book as saying, I think Earl innately knew how to get the best out of every player, and if he couldn't, he just moved you out. Author Miller says, Weaver often relished confrontation with players. If they learned to handle him, they would do better in the pressure cooker of big league baseball games. So while it might have been borderline traumatic or infuriating to play for Earl for some guys, there was an intentional method to Earl's madness that I believe he was in far more agency and control of than one might believe at face value. Again, crazy like a fox. I hope you enjoyed this episode on Earl Weaver today. If you did, I'd love it if you can follow the show, like, subscribe, review. All of those things would help this show move out of the cold, dark, lifeless abyss that the internet algorithms can put it in. And I'll close by leaving you with just one more quote on Weaver, this one again from Tom Boswell of the Washington Post, who had this to say upon Earl's induction into the Baseball Hall of Fame: No manager belongs in the Hall of Fame more. As much as any person in a generation, Weaver encapsulated the fire, the humor, the brains, the childishness, the wisdom, and the goofy fun of baseball. Whatever you think he was, you're right. But he was probably also, to some degree, the opposite of that as well. Thanks as always for listening.